Hi, welcome to the Antiuniversity week of meetings. And this this meeting is being held by the Pupils' Land Policy. So I'm first going to do a presentation, giving you some facts and figures about land ownership and land use in the UK. And then we're going to look a bit more about what people are doing to fight for land justice. After we do the presentation, we'll have some time for some discussion. So firstly, when we talk about land, we're not just talking about the physical soil, we're actually talking about the whole surface of the earth, which will include the land and water. And we're also, a lot of people, when they think of land, they think of, oh, it's rural areas, but no, land is urban and land is rural as well. And also includes minerals, all that which lies underneath the surface of the land, and it also includes the atmosphere. So we're going to look at then the facts, first land use, and then look at ownership and control of land. It's a bit difficult to do this on the Zoom meeting, but just to let you know that this is a YouTube video from Friends of the Earth that's worth checking out. In 100 seconds, it goes through how land is used in the UK, and it's very well done. So have a look at that. So here's some other figures, and we can see here that farming is a huge use of land. So 55% if we don't include things like sheep. If we include all of that, so the semi-wild, we actually get up to closer to 70%. Homes and gardens represent quite a small amount, under 5%, as do forests. So if we think of forests and peat bogs as very important for issues around climate change, then we have quite a lot of work to do in that respect in terms of land use. Here's another way of looking at it, because obviously foreign nations things are quite different. So Scotland has much more what we might call natural, though obviously it's logging land as well, it's not that natural, but farmland is a much smaller amount than in England, which is 72%. But the built-on is more in England, very small in Scotland. But if we look at the green urban, it's a very small amount of land. So basically, in conclusion, the main use of land is for agriculture, and in particular, it is for livestock. Now, whether it's actually grazing animals or whether it's producing crops to feed that livestock. But even what might be called natural land is still a resource. So it's being used for sheep, it's used for grouse, it's used for logging, it's used for mining. So in terms of the amount that ordinary people own, it's for homes and gardens, it's less than 5%. So let's have a quick look at land ownership. So England has has over half the amount of land in the UK, but its population is by far the greatest. But surprisingly, things like the Crown and the Church, which used to be big landowners, aren't so big landowners anymore. In fact, conservation organizations and the government own more land than the Crown and the Church. The biggest landowners are private owners. Only 2%, well, 18% by companies, and but only 2% of those by offshore or overseas. Woman here, Charlotte Townsend, has 1,500 acres in Dorset. And you can see the kind of activity she does there. She's big into her hunting, but she also manages to own 20 acres, not so much, but still extremely valuable acres in Holland Park in London. So a few more facts. It's sort of, you get a picture by putting together sort of a number of different facts. 69% of land is owned by 0.6% of the population. 70% of land is agricultural land, and 150,000 people own all of it. And as I said before, housing is concentrated on 5% of the country's landmass. So in terms of landowners, the really most people don't own very much at all. So it's more unequal when you look at the share of aristocrats descendant from the Normans, many of these. So 1/3 of British land is still owned by them. Scotland is particularly unequal. 432 people own half the land in Scotland. And another figure, the property wealth of the top 10% of households is nearly 5 times greater than the wealth of the bottom half of all households combined. Excuse me, sorry. All right. So the other issue is this lack of transparency. So 15% of land is actually unregistered. And this is because you only have to register it if you're selling the land. But so much of the land has never been sold, so it won't be registered. So, for example, the crown, the aristocracy, and the church, we have figures for them, not accurate as they could be because of the lack of transparency. So, in conclusion, I would say that land is highly unequal. These are typical of the kind of people who will own land. So, for example, there's a company called Underlies that owns a massive farm in Norfolk, and it's owned by someone called Count Luca Paduli, who does live here, I think, most of the time, but is originally a foreign owner. And of course, then you have Duke of Westminster, who owns 129,000 acres, some of this in Westminster, but also he owns grouse moors and all sorts of other things around the country. So these are the kind of people that we're talking about. We're not talking about ordinary house owners. We're actually talking about the people who own a considerable amount of land, whether it be farmland, whether it be grouse moors, whether it be urban land. So what's the link? Does it matter? Now, many people would argue that it doesn't matter, and many people work trying to negotiate and work within the current land ownership system, trying to have some effect on the current landowners and trying to make them change how land is used. But I think there's a very important link here. And I think we have to be wary of how much we can achieve in changes in land use without changing land ownership. So, for example, if you own the land, obviously you can make decisions about what to do with it. So if you want to have a grouse moor, you can have a grouse moor. You can grow if you want to grow food for cattle, you'll grow food for cattle. And what the decisions are based on what makes a profit, or if you're rich enough, what the landowner just fancies. So, for example, in Scotland, we've got landowners who, one moment they're busy having a sporting estate, and it's grouse moors or deer stalking, and then it's quite possible that they decide to become conservation landowners. Okay, we might think this is a better use of land, but they could easily change back the next generation and decide that they're going to do something else with it again, maybe build houses on it. So yes, whether or not they can develop their land to a certain extent depends on the planning system. But I think most people's experience of the current planning system is that it's very, very difficult to become involved in it, and it's weighted against the public interest and in favor of developers and those who want to make profit from the development of that land. People's land policy saying that this land is our land, that's how we need to see it. And this is not a new idea if you look around the world. So whether it be in Africa or in Latin America, amongst indigenous communities, land struggles are big. Land struggles are really top of the agenda. However, in the UK, we have yet really to build any kind of land justice movement. And why is it important that we do so? So it is the basis of all wealth. Whatever food, housing, the materials that we use to make houses, clothing, everything. our basic social life, our cultural life is all based in land. And if we don't have access and control of this land, we're completely dependent on those who do have access and control for every access part of our life, whether it be where we live, with what we eat, we're able to socialize and meet with other people. So it matters for a number of these reasons: housing, food, resources, work and livelihood, community social space, recreation, things like the right to roam, and the environment. I'm going to focus a little bit on three of these. The housing crisis is effectively a land crisis. So people talk about the price of houses, but the price of houses is basically the price of land. So we found that the price of dwellings has increased by 4 times between 1995 and 2015, and even more since then. It enriched a lot of people. In central London, for example, 80% of the value of a property is the value of the land. In other parts of the country, where land is less valuable, then obviously there's a different relationship, but it's still, we need to look at the price of land in order to determine what the price of housing is. And house prices have increased greatly. And again, as I said, as a result of increasing land prices. It's estimated 74% of these increases have been explained by the rising price of land, because we have to keep in mind that land is a finite asset. We can't have more of it. So it's very susceptible to increases in prices. The other problem that we've seen in recent years, for example, like right to buy, is we now see that a lot of the social housing stock has been bought up. And one figure is that landlords own almost 40% of former council houses. So they're not even living in these, not even the right to buy. They bought them and now rent them out. So basically they're using it as a way of making profit. And also we've seen an increase in overseas investment in the UK housing market. The other way that land increases is when there's been an improvement in infrastructure. So the Jubilee line, for example, when it was opened, it increased local residential land values within 1,000 yards of each of the stations by 13 billion. So this is a lot of money that people have made by doing nothing, by just having the luck to have a house or some kind of property near that improvement in infrastructure. The same thing will happen with the Crossrail. And really all this improvement is being paid for by taxpayers, and people who benefit from this don't have to pay anything at all. There's also been some cases in more feudal situations, in more of the feudal estates that still exist, where some of these feudal laws still exist. And there's been some examples where the landowners have charged tenants on their land ridiculous amounts of money for all sorts of things. For example, this money here, £179 to allow 2 screws in the wall. There's more in this article on land barons. So really, people who are tenants in some of these estates, which are effectively still feudal, are completely at the mercy of the landowners. So the other way that land matters is because of land and food. And what we've seen is land has increasingly been used for large agribusiness industrial farming. And as I mentioned before, much of this is based on meat eating, either grazing of cattle, sheep, or growing the crops to feed the cattle. But also we've now seen another problem in that many investors who really aren't farmers at all are buying up agricultural land because it's a good way of avoiding inheritance tax. Often they might just leave the land, or really all they have to do is put a few sheep on it, and it's considered to be farming. So it's very hard for individuals or co-ops to get land for other types of farming. And for example, the Land Workers Alliance and the Ecological Land Co-op are trying very hard to increase the amount of land that's being used for farm based on agroecological principles, which is more in harmony with nature, and also much higher standards of animal welfare. But the problem is the subsidy system now, and very likely cultural as well, though Land Workers Alliance is fighting to amend this, is that a lot of these only go to the larger landowners. So if you're a very small farmer, you're not going to get as much benefit from these subsidies. So it's a sort of skewed in the direction of the larger farmers. So it's quite likely, many have predicted that it's going to get worse, that more small farms are going to go under. The environment, how we use land, is absolutely critical for issues to do with climate change and biodiversity. So there's all sorts of figures on this, but deforestation, 7% of emissions, 11.7, for example, from livestock and manure, resource extraction, buildings. These are some figures that I found. There are different ones, but whatever ones you look at, all these land uses are causing problems for the environment. And another way you can see how landowners have power is for this example of the Newberry bypass, which some of you might remember. And the local land owner, Sir Richard Sutton, was always going on about how he was a guardian of the countryside. And so they tried, the campaigners tried to get some support from him, but instead he actually supplied the hardcore for the project. And he also put in a proposal to build 1,600 houses, a hotel, and a golf course. So in other words, rather than being a guardian of the countryside, he was basically a guardian of himself. How much profit could he make out of the Newberry bypass? And this is the power that landowners have. And this is why there is a relationship between owning land and land use that actually benefits the public in terms of housing, food, environment, and all aspects of our lives. So there have been efforts at land reform. Mostly we have to look to Scotland for our efforts and for examples. So there's been 2 land reform acts. One significant change is that when people are talking about land use in Scotland, much more the rhetoric is public benefit, not private gain. For the most part, still in England and elsewhere, it's as if it's your right to use it for your own gain. That's the whole point of being a landowner. But they're shifting a little bit the way people talk about land and saying that really the landowner has a responsibility to use it for the public benefit. There's also been an increase in the right to buy, which is good, and there's been quite a few examples of people buying the land. However, it doesn't. This in Scotland, they haven't really challenged land ownership, the inequality. They still haven't gone against the biggest landowners and challenged what they're doing with the land, and it's still they're aiming for 2% of land to be in community ownership, but I don't think they've even reached that yet. But the problem is the fund for this community right to buy that the government provides is incredibly small, and you really need quite a lot of money. So there's been a very good example of a community buyout in southern Scotland on something called the Langholm Estate, and there's an aristocratic owner who ran it as a grouse moor, and he had so many acres already. I think he thought maybe it was he didn't need so many grouse moors and he had enough grouse moors. So he agreed to sell the land to the community. But despite the fact that he basically stole the land thousands, hundreds of years ago, he was able to, wanted £6 million for this grouse moor. So the community, of course, has to raise money, and it was very difficult for them, but they did succeed. But, how much can we actually get hold of land this way if the landowner still has the power to charge market prices for, which is not based on anything to do with public benefit and doesn't take into account how they got the land in the first place, which was probably through some kind of dodgy inheritance back in the dawn of the Norman period. Another initiative that's happened recently was a report called Land for the Many. And this report was commissioned for the Labour Party. George Monbiot was involved in editing, plus some other people that had run the Land Justice Network. And it was a very interesting report. They were very much aiming to reduce speculation on land so that you could actually have lower land prices, which would make it easier for people to get hold of land. And also increase transparency. And they also had some interesting ideas about land ownership, maybe transferring land to more of some public trust. However, there was a certain amount of a brake put on it really by the Labour Party, because they were quite afraid of land prices crashing too fast, because land, as I said, house prices are related to land prices. If land prices go down, then house prices go down. And because so much of the economy is based on rising house prices in terms of getting consumers to spend, in terms of providing employment, that it would cause problems to the economy the way it is structured at the moment. There was no real effort to tackle unequal ownership, and it seemed a lot of it was focused on people becoming homeowners, as opposed to getting hold of land for thinking about land use and how to make sure that land was being used for the public benefit. And of course, the other problem, it was very much a top-down strategy, because it was relied on the Labour Party to adopt the manifesto, and they really only adopted some of it. And also then, of course, you relied on Corbyn getting elected, which he didn't get elected. So really, that's sort of on hold at the moment. And I suppose that's what we feel in the People's Land Policy, is that we really need to start from the ground up. We need to actually build a movement that will then be much more longer lived than a particular political party or a particular politician, but it's actually grounded in a mass movement. So our vision sees land as a commons, very important concept to us. So we need to start seeing land as a gift of nature that belongs to all of us. And together we act as stewards or caretakers. That's another concept. Instead of seeing land as, oh, we can make profit for ourselves, we need to see ourselves, yes, we need to make a living, obviously, but we're also people who are on the land, wherever they are also caretakers and need to think about this generation and future generations. The commons is also a social process. It's also a way of making decisions. So it's about encouraging more and more people to be getting involved in making decisions about how land is used and distributed. So what do? Well, we produced this draft working towards a People's Land Policy. And we see ourselves as contributing to the creation of a mass movement. By no means do we see ourselves as really a movement. We're just a small part of it. We're working on developing ideas for change by listening to people, by consulting people, to hear what's important to them, what would benefit them, and the various things that they are involved in. And by gathering together all these ideas in one sort of manifesto, then we hope to work for policy changes at different levels. but again, stressing that this has to be built on a much wider movement, which is doing other things apart from, just lobbying politicians or focusing on Parliament. So we've done a number of things. We've had workshops at Land Workers Alliance Summer Gathering in the Southeast. We've done sessions at the Oxford Rural Farming Conference. This is all by focusing on land in relation to land reform and relevance to food in this cases at the Oxford Rural Farming Conference. And we've done other workshops that we did at the New Economics Foundation. Since lockdown, since the pandemic, we've been doing online seminars, and one was on land and the environment, one was land and food, and the next one we're planning at the moment is about making decisions about land, how we involve people in direct and participatory democracy. So we're not trying to impose a particular view of how land should be used, but we're trying to get ideas from others and work on ways of involving people in making these decisions. So we've managed to bring quite a lot of people together to discuss in some of these seminars. These are some of the organizations that have spoken. Land Workers Alliance, I've mentioned before, really a very important organization in the food movement. Sustain is mainly involved in urban growing and also peri-urban growing. John Muir Trust, which is a conservation landowner, mainly based in Scotland, but not only, though they also focus on other aspects of managing the estate, like the livelihood aspect, people making a living on their estates, and also people using their land for recreation. Roots into Growing is a Black-led group in London, which is aiming to encourage the Black community, many young people, to get more involved in growing. And there's a whole load of different food growing projects. Organically is one, and there's loads of others. Friends of the Earth also spoke, and we also had a session that we organized jointly with London Mining Network. And people who spoke there were Coal Action Network and Say Yes to Life, No to Mining. So really, we've heard from a range of people, and we've incorporated the ideas from these seminars into our People's Land Policy document. We also aim to provide resources as part of contributing to a movement. So we've got our website, and we've got a number of resources there. And we also try to promote other land initiatives as much as we ourselves as a group are affiliated to Land Workers Alliance and the London Mining Network, because this is a way of making more links, and more links build a better movement. And individuals are involved in Just Space, Radical Housing Network, Granville Community Kitchen, and one of our members was also involved in the St. Anne's project in Haringey. Also, individual members are part of the Right to Roam campaign, and we've also been involved in initiatives of shared assets. So it's very important, we feel, to make links between all different aspects of a potential movement. So beginnings of a movement. So I've partially shown, I think, but I'd like to stress again that a lot of people's campaigning about land is really through another topic. So people might be a housing campaigner, they might be a food campaigner, they might be campaigning on community space, they might be an environmental campaigner. All of these are effectively campaigns about land, but they're phrased in not in terms of land justice. And we feel, as part of building a movement, we need to begin to see all these struggles as part of a land struggle. And that way would bring us enable us to build a stronger, more effective movement of all these different campaigns, all these different aspects of the movement came closer together. So the embryo of a movement now, there had been the Land Justice Network, but unfortunately that fell apart a couple of years ago before the pandemic. And different people have gone their ways, but nevertheless, there are still quite a few people about. The Right to Roam campaign has been set up by Guy Shrubsole and Nick Hayes, who have both now written very good books. Shared assets was involved in organizing the first Land for What conference, where a lot of us met, a lot of people that are involved in people's land policy met, which was back, I think, in 2017. And they're still doing excellent work, and their website is full of important resources, and they've got loads of projects and initiatives. Land in Our Names their aim is reconnecting Black communities with land in Britain. And again, though I think a lot of it might be focused on food, they still see it in terms of land justice, which is so they see themselves as the land campaigners. 3 Acres and a Cow is been going for years, and the person behind it, Robin Gray, has been a major force really in the land justice movement. And the 3 Acres and a Cow is basically a show with singing and visuals, etc. Very imaginative and interactive show, which looks at the history of land struggles in the UK. And since the pandemic, they've also produced a lot of online resources as well. So it's well worth looking at that. The Land magazine comes out now and then, but it's still a very useful tool for people to look at. And then we've got Guy Shrubsole's Who Owns England, which is also helped by someone called Anna Powell. And you get loads of data on different aspects of land as ammunition. I think someone has actually done a sort of offshoot of this and done something, I think it's called Who Owns Norfolk or something. So more and more people are trying to find out who owns land in their area as part of building up a campaign. So our next step, and we think this is quite an important one, is to look at decision-making, land justice by the people and for the people. Because none of this can happen if, as we said, it doesn't come to emerge from the ground up, and loads of people are involved in talking about land, making decisions about land. So we're going to look at the idea of participatory democracy, how it works in different places. One of our first speakers is going to be someone from the Bene Vivere movement, which is good living movement in Latin America. And they've built up a huge network, a huge movement that involves all sorts of issues around land. But then we're also going to look at in the UK as well, what some of the initiatives are. And there's different types of participatory democracy. So we're going to examine it also from a theoretical perspective. We're also going to look at the idea of the commons, which is another potential model as a way of involving people in decision making. And then the last one in the series will be looking, well, how do we build a movement? How do we bring all these people together who are campaigning in their own way about land issues? And because at the moment we're very fragmented and very weak. Obviously the pandemic hasn't helped matters, but even before the land rights movement in the UK was nowhere near, we really need to learn, and that's what we've learned from our seminars. We need to learn with what's going on in the global south, because that's where the inspiration is. And we need to take our inspiration to see what a real land justice movement looks like. And hopefully we can take on board some of the really important work and ideas that is happening elsewhere in the world. So thank you very much. We're now, if you are interested in getting involved, please email us at People's Land Policy, or look at our blog. We're always welcoming new people into our working group. And so we will be preparing for this next seminar series as our next work project, which is going to kick off at the end of October. All right, thank you very much.
Adam, do you want to speak?
I just had a question, really, not really about like my own journey or whatever, but about the planning system. Like, I don't really know much about the planning system. It seems quite shrouded in secrecy and bureaucracy. And I just was wondering if you had any thoughts about what role it plays within the larger system in kind of perpetuating the inequality in the land system? Like, what's its function as a system within the larger piece?
Bonnie?
Do you want me to answer that, or do you want to answer it, David? I don't know.
You go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a real problem, and because you're right. I mean, if you think, let's say you want to challenge a planning application, it is so difficult to get information. You have got to have loads and loads of time to plow through extensive documents in order to understand what the planning application is. So once if you manage to do that, then the other problem is that the developer has the right, let's say that they actually turn down a planning application. Well, the developer has the right to appeal. But if it rules in favor of the developer, then the people don't have the right to appeal. So organizations, for example, like the John Muir Trust in Scotland, have had to raise a lot of money because they've challenged a few planning applications, and it costs them loads of money that ordinary people don't have. So yes, I think the planning system is a major problem, which is why we're going to look at that in a bit more detail in our next seminar series. Because how can you make sure that planning is actually done by direct democracy, not by some secretive group of bureaucrats? And the white paper, I mean, it's already bad enough the way it is, but the new white paper is going to make it even worse. Basically, they just want to be able to rubber stamp developers doing what they want with the land. So in other words, you've already got private landowners being able to make decisions about the land. Now, and we've got the same situation with government, which is meant to be representing people, is able to do things without really consulting those people and without a transparent system. So I don't know if you know anything more about it. Maybe someone else in the group might know more about it, but we are going to look at that, and we're going to look at potential alternatives to the current planning system in the next seminar series.
Can read it out. So Rowan's question is, how involved is big agribusiness like Bayer, Monsanto, Syngenta, etc. in England's agricultural land?
Yeah, again, this is something that I don't have the facts and figures to hand. I don't think they're as involved as they might be in the US. But I mean, the one example that I gave of a large landowner, I think in the UK, it's more big private farmers rather than a particular company like this that's owning a lot of agricultural land. But again, it's something that needs to be talked about. But when we did our seminars on land and food, these kind of global corporations weren't mentioned particularly as more of a problem than just your large agribusiness, your large private farmers, or maybe you've got some corporations, but maybe again, someone here might know more of the facts on this, might have some examples. Leslie's got her hand up, maybe she knows.
No, I don't know about agribusiness. I think you're right, Barney, about it's not the huge amount that there is in the States and in Latin and South America. But another huge problem that we have here from landowning point of view is companies owning land or land owned by individuals for tax purposes. And that's, I know 500 acres just outside London, where we were looking at a peri-urban farm, are just owned by somebody who's doing nothing with them. It's an old farm and it's now sitting completely empty, making money for someone on paper. So this is another huge problem. Okay,
so Brian, thanks. Brian has posted an explanation of the algorithmic decision-making process. Chat if people want to have a look. And also, I think David, you had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question? David Berry?
Yeah. I got a bit confused about how to phrase the question, so I might come back.
Okay, give it a go, David.
All right. So I was just thinking about how, like, you know, with the ecological crisis that we're facing, like we're going to come into a period of like food shortages as a sort of probably as a kind of regular occurrence, and how the land question becomes really kind of important in that, and how we as like communities can continue to feed ourselves. As I get like how do these connections that you're forming through this kind of like trying to build a movement, how does that kind of as a strategy, how could that fold into that in some way?
Thanks, that's great.
Okay, I've just put a reference here to Chris Mage, Small Farm for Future. He was one of our speakers at one of our land and food seminars, and he addresses this question in depth because he feels that's exactly what's going to happen. He thinks that with things like pandemics, and the ecological crisis, that really, that if we don't get our act together about being a little bit more self-reliant and being able to provide our own food, we're going to have serious problems. So he's in favor of having more and more people going onto the land and becoming growers. And he thinks there's so many people. When we did our seminars, all these people, they wanted to go and do it. They wanted to either grow in the cities, they wanted to grow near the cities, or they actually wanted to go and become farmers. And he thinks that is the way forward that we've actually got. And really, when you think about jobs, I mean, do you really want to work in the kind of jobs that are on offer at the moment? Or would you prefer to have some land and be a farmer, and or be part of a co-op? So really, I think I would personally say I would like to see the extension of the ecological land co-op model. And the ecological land co-op actually gets hold of land and then rents it out to tenants, but for more than lifetime leases, long enough for us to have 2 generations. So, if we could get hold of more land, then we would be able to be much more possibility of people going and growing food that we need, that wouldn't be sold for export, that would be fruit and veg to be eaten in this country. And the urban growing movement, the peri-urban growing movement, they're huge. But the obstacle, as Leslie just said, they're trying to get land, is the price of land. And as long as land is unequally distributed, and as long as land is some kind of speculative asset, then it's good. That's why the whole thing has to be put together. We've got to challenge land as speculative asset so we can get the price down. We've also started to get hold of land. And I think someone also mentioned here about what about trespass and all of that. Well, that, I mean, obviously is a, occupation is another possibility, but to get hold of land, especially land that's maybe being left empty that no one's doing anything with, if there were people who, but then it's difficult to sustain it because it's like squatting or anything. I mean, you can only last so long, and then, maybe a year or two, then people are thrown off and then you can't sustain it. But I mean, you're right. We have to think in that direction, but we have to be able to get hold of land, which means we have to challenge the current landowners and everything else about the system.
Great, thanks. So Gali, you've come back. Have you got a new computer?
I did. Can you hear me now? Great. And sorry, I just want to say, Brian, I wasn't meaning on algorithmic decision making as bad. I mean, I'm a data scientist myself, so obviously I think there's lots of positives to algorithmic decision making. I just want to say that one of the things that is of interest of mine, because I've been looking into it, is that more recently the government to say kind of to give a quota of how many new houses each area in the UK has to build. They've tried to centralize this. So basically, if local areas haven't made a plan recently or reviewed their plans about how many houses they're going to provide, how many new houses they're going to provide every year, then it's now going to be decided by this kind of centralized algorithm that they've made. And you know, we say algorithm, and usually that's taken a really bad context. I don't necessarily think the algorithm is bad, but what I think is that there hasn't been a lot of, some of the transparency around the algorithm is about how it works, but for example, replicating the numbers of the government and understanding how decisions around the algorithm were made are not necessarily super transparent and obvious, like they have a white paper and such. But I'm just interested because in this kind of conversation, obviously those things are gonna start changing the way that planning permissions, for example, are issued. And it's gonna, you know, I think there's a technological conversation to be had about land ownership. As for example, there's also a big push for the UK now to get a hold of literally all of the land so that there is no unregistered land anymore. And all of these things are being done to create data to then use data for stuff, you know. And so I would, it's just of interest of mine, like if there's any kind of technology position or things like that in the group and such. That's all.
Just like to reply one thing about the housing. This is why top-down decisions about land use are a problem. And if the government is coming up with various methods of deciding how land is going to be used without the involvement of people, then it is a real problem. I know the Radical Housing Network is questioning a lot of the building of the new houses because, you know, someone, you know, we were talking about the environmental crisis. Well, building new houses is one of, you know, it actually creates quite a lot of emissions. So, and in London, for example, there's a group called Action on Empty Homes. Well, there's loads of empty homes. So they're arguing for why can't we refurbish? Why can't we move people into empty homes? What about all the empty offices? What about all the second homes and the Airbnbs, et cetera, et cetera? But all of this, that's why you need a holistic view of how our land is used. It can't be done separately. And also, if you're building houses somewhere, you could be knocking down a wood, and the wood is there because of environmental reasons. So you need to be looking at everything. And I think the government with various formulas and, you know, oh, we're going to do this for housing. I mean, not only is it just benefiting those who profiteer, but it's also rather incompetent, really. And, you know, you do one thing with one hand and then you do something else with another hand that actually contradicts it. You know, there's all these aims have to come together. They can't be looked at separately. And that's why we're trying to get, you know, like a discussion here. We don't have the People's Land Policy hardly has all the answers. What we want to do is create a movement where there's so many people involved that we can discuss what we think needs to be done together and not have experts or politicians telling us, you know, what we should be doing. Because, you know, I feel a bit funny here I volunteered to do this talk, but I haven't been the expert before. So, I mean, you know, I mean, I've learned a lot because I've been involved in that, but I don't really see myself as an expert. So I might struggle with, and some of the other PLP people as well, you know, we've learned as we've gone along.
Thanks. Leslie, you got your hand up?
Yes, only because I wanted to reply to the algorithm issue, because the reason it makes my blood run cold is because usually algorithms have fairly simple, I mean, I know it's a tool and tools can be used for good or for bad, but usually they have very simple criteria. And I think one of the things that Bonnie, I mean, I'm part of the People's Land Policy group too, but Bonnie's been saying is that we need principles by which we make these decisions, not just, you know, discrete. So we need more houses. Okay, there's some land. Let's build houses. You know, just if we silo everything, you know, we're bound to make some kind of a problem in another area because they're all interwoven. And the problem with an algorithm is, I think, you please correct me, that they're quite simplistic in the amount of information that they can juggle. So I feel that they would be even possibly make worse decisions than our marvelous government, who take decisions in very, very narrow silos, and mostly with the interests of those who have money and lobby them more strongly in their minds.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just intervene and say that you're not wrong in thinking that there can be simplified things, and there definitely is.
Yeah.
But I think there's also another question, which is around equity and certain areas where there's a lot more influence by some versus areas where there's influence by others now are bound to the same rule. And that is somewhere where an algorithm can help, in which if done properly, I have to say that, and transparently. So for example, us knowing exactly the numbers, how they're being computed, and when they're being computed, and with which data they're being computed. They can also provide a lot of, well, now everyone has to do it the same. And that also has a lot of benefits. But I see, you're right, like just hand waving to everyone will do this exact thing, and there's no question about what could be good or bad about that is definitely a big issue with algorithms.
Thank you.
I could see that, so like Brian in his comment in the chat does say at the end, so like the main point of the system is to prevent inappropriate development rather than encouraging equitable access to land, through the algorithms. And I guess that's where we're coming from, is actually more about the equitable access, great. So are there any other questions? Let's have a look.
I was wondering if Rachel wanted to say something more about her point, because it's like, it's all very well saying, and someone else said as well, we need to get hold of land, but how? And because at the moment, for example, the ecological land co-op basically has to raise money. They have to raise money and then hope to buy land that they then can lease to the farmers. So, and the same thing with the organizations like John Muir Trust, they end up having to raise funds from people to get hold of land. I don't know, Rachel was suggesting that maybe we need to go a bit further than that. So I don't know if she does want to develop her point or not.
Rachel, you there?
Anyway, okay, yes. I think people have seen it, and I think she's right that when you look back after World War II, and when a lot of the soldiers came home from the war, and there weren't things for them, they squatted, and they took over, for example, old bases, and I think I can't remember where it was, but they took over, like, I think it was in the Midlands somewhere, and they took over a whole area that had been an old base, and they basically made it their home. A whole group of them lived there, and they had, they had everything, and it was almost made legal at one point. I can't exactly remember what happened, but really it was actions like that forced the government to even think about the idea of council housing and things like that, because the soldiers were actually squatting and taking over land. And maybe in order to kickstart things, there should be more actions like that.
Rachel, you're here. Would you want to elaborate on your point?
Yeah, I can try. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. It's just that I don't have a very stable connection, so just bear that in mind. But yeah, I mean, I was thinking, because there was, there was a very healthy squatting movement all over the UK, especially in London, but obviously the law has changed around squatting now, and that has, I mean, there might be other people who know more about it, but that has weakened the squatting movement in urban areas. but there's still, you know, there's still a lot to learn from that whole history of squatting. And that was a really good point that Bonnie just made about people returning from the war. And that makes me think about constituencies. So there's more sympathy for certain types of, let's say, squatters than others. And at the moment, there's a huge problem emerging and a huge discourse emerging around, you know, the cladding crisis post Grenfell, which then has put the spotlight on leaseholders and the leasehold and freehold system. And someone mentioned in the chat that commonhold was now a concept that was being brought to bear in that discourse. And so there are these kind of political gaps opening up out of crises. And I think that's definitely an interesting, you know, an interesting opportunity to see what can be said. So when I talk about constituencies, the sort of people that are involved in the cladding crisis are leaseholders, but they're not a constituency that probably is particularly radically thinking about land reform, but they are in a position where they're having to think more radically because of the crisis that they're in. And so, you know, there's a demonstration, for example, on the 16th of September. But what I've noticed is that they're a constituency that don't make radical demands at the moment. So, you know, it's about how do you find constituencies like returning, you know, military personnel who are homeless. How do you enable constituencies like that? And then how do you sort of radicalize people who are in a crisis, in a housing crisis? A lot of people are.
Thanks, Rachel. Gala, you had your hand up again. Did you want to come back on that point?
I actually had a different question. It's not Gala this time, it's someone else. But I just had a different question, but if someone wants to address Rachel's comments first, no worries.
I just wanted to say, so like, you know, part of Bonnie's presentation was about so like how disparate and fragmented the various constituencies that Rachel, you know, or one of the constituencies, you know, that Rachel was talking about, and you know that is our problem, you know, or part of the problem of sort of like creating a movement. But there's one thing about that constituency is it has got the, you know, the ear of government. Government's not done anything about it yet, but it is having to like dig into its pocket to address that sort of issue. And again, I just wanted to sort of like, you know, someone posted a question about Rachel, I think it was you, about sort of like how do we get hold of land? So, you know, my experiences of being involved in a community land trust in sort of like London is that even though you come to these issues with the best intentions, very quickly you fall into the behavior that you might expect from a developer, you know, about having to make decisions about affordability and, you know, what compromises that you know, that you have to make in order to get hold of land. And also, you know, the way that the finance system works is it's like it obviously sort of like favors developers, because in order to get that the cash that you might need, you need to have a track record. And how do you get a track record if, you know, you can't? So like, you know, even though we might want equity, the system is almost designed to stamp it out. Do you know what I mean? The system is almost like there to sort of like maintain the status quo, and you know, so there's a lot of rhetoric about sort of like participation and involvement, but you know, the system does not facilitate that. Sorry, not Gala. You you can come back now.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks Bonnie, as well, for your really nice presentation. I got really excited listening to it. I was just kind of curious to hear from all of you or any of you on like what if anything, what kind of technological tools, if any, you would find valuable in this kind of study and work that you're doing. I'm just curious.
Well, I know that Guy Shrubsole has, and Anna Powell, I think her name is, have done a lot with mapping. So, and I think that's quite important because it's always important for wherever you live to be able to map who owns what where you live. And so I think they've used that as a technological tool to be able to identify. And you go on the website and, you know, I was just looking up where I was visiting. You know, I was on holiday somewhere and we're doing some walking. I was like, who the hell are these people? You know, Rushmore Estate, I think I was looking up or something. And you go on the website and, you know, all of a sudden, you know, you learn quite about, you know, it was, you know, the landowner. And so I think those technological tools are very important for our movement. I'm not sure what else. I don't know, Leslie or David, do you have any other ideas? Or do you have ideas yourself, what you think? What could be used?
No, I mean, me, myself, no. I think I really like the kind of stuff you've talked about kind of building, you know, like doing work from the ground up. So I always just think like, what kind of tools would help more people have more of a say somehow in like what's happening around them. I don't have any immediate ideas. I just kind of, I guess my feeling is like, it feels like people want to be involved. Like it feels like they would want to get involved somehow. And to me, then the problem is like somehow they're missing some kind of entry point where it's like, well, there's all these kind of really interesting ideas and probably even steps to take and things to do. But it's like, how can you engage people with that? And I just don't know enough, but that's kind of what I'm interested in.
Well, I'm hoping that maybe, oh, David.
I was just going to say, you know, we've been talking about the current planning system and sort of like algorithms, and you know, again, the current planning system it squeezes out any sort of like motivation that you might want to be actively involved in developments in your community. The way that sort of like local authorities present plans and the data is labyrinthine. You know, you'll come across sort of like pages with sort of like, you know, sometimes hundreds, sometimes like thousands of sort of like documents. Now, I don't know, again, when we were involved in sort of like developing, working on our master plan for our community land trust, what people wanted was pictures. You know, they wanted to see how the development would occur. Do you know what I mean? So, you know, people sort of like really, so we, you know, literally sort of like got some architects and sort of like, you know, produced a master plan with like 3D modeling, all of this sort of stuff. So, you know, something that, you know, like I say, it's not a perfect system, but, you know, something that could sort of like present proposals, development proposals in a more accessible way would be something. Anyway, my point.
I suppose it's something that would come up in the next seminar series as well on participatory democracy, because I think people will probably talk about how you can use the technology to bring people together. And again, we're just learning about all of that. And what's going to be interesting is because we've got people from Latin America, it's going to be really interesting to see how they have involved people and what role technology has played there, or whether it's more face-to-face. Could I just go back, David, because there's a few things in the chat.
Yeah, sure.
There was a question about community land banking. And I know what land banking is. I'm not sure what community land banking is, because I know that land banking has been a problem because developers will buy up land basically to put in the bank for future development. And often the people in the community don't even know who owns it. And this is, again, they often might wait until prices go up, they can get more money. And it's I know that Guy Shrubsole has a lot about it in his book, where it is a real obstacle that, you know, he'd like to see the elimination of land banking. I'm not sure what community land banking is. So I don't know if Sophie would like to ask your question.
Would you like to explain a little bit more about that?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
But maybe I'm using the wrong terminology. I went to, maybe it was a land trust, but it seemed like they were talking about land banking. I can't really remember it, but it was something it sounded like they were using the terminology land bank in Wales, and it seemed that it was like a cooperative led by the people kind of land banking initiative. So maybe that's, I don't know if that's different to a community land trust. So I was just wanting to know if you understood those terms and could, shine some light for me.
Yeah, I think then, so I think that it sort of links to another comment that someone made. I know that there's quite a few people who have put together proposals for some way of putting all land in the hands of some kind of trust. And someone called it common hold here. And I know that someone from the New Economics Foundation, Duncan McCann, has done some work on this as well, on the idea that no one would own land. All you'd own, which what you had was on the land, and the land itself would be held by this kind of public trust. Obviously, the key thing is how to make sure it's truly democratically managed. But I think this is, a lot of thinkers are thinking, well, why not just take land out of private ownership altogether? And then you just own your house, or you own this, or you own whatever, but you don't actually own the land. And there's been quite a lot of work on this. So someone made that comment. I'm just having a look here. So it's worth looking at. So I think he mentioned a paper. So I'm trying to find it here. Transferred to common hold ownership. Yeah. So I think a lot of people are beginning to think about that. Brian, has talked about that. So I don't know if Brian wanted to say anything more about that.
Brian, are you there? He's still eating his dinner, unfortunately, Bonnie.
Well, anyways, put a lot of interesting stuff in the chat, so it's worth having a look at here.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's loads of thinking about that, about how to transfer it. But again, then we're back to the issue. Well, how do you make these landowners give up their land? And I know that in Duncan McCann's paper, they did talk about actually compensating landowners, but I mean, it's going to cost a lot of money. The other thing that they've come up with is that if a landowner isn't using land for the public good, that the government can publicly, compulsory buy it. And there is some things where communities have the right to buy in Scotland if they can show that the landowner isn't actually doing anything useful with the land. But of course, then you don't have the money to actually buy it. So that's the problem. There's, what else is in the chat?
Sorry, I just wanted to quickly add, maybe just to provide a different perspective. In other countries, and don't know how many, but I know in Mexico, the government owns what they call, translating, so I don't even know if this is the right translation, but the subland, so anything underneath your land. So like you own the patch of land, but anything underneath. And this has caused lots of interesting, maybe good or bad, I don't actually know enough about it, but for example, Mexico has a lot of petroleum, and so what has happened is that if you do find oil in your land, a lot of people hide it because the government then has a right to basically take your land for the value of the land with nothing built on it, which is the cheapest way. And that has created also a lot of people hiding, for example, when they find pyramids and stuff in their land from lots of our pre-Hispanic cultures, because if you find a pyramid, the government can basically take your land for very little value. And so it has actually had a backwards effect in lots of stuff that's about Mexico, like, for example, the pyramid stuff, because land that was owned privately then for some reason ends up in public land, and they find that there's like entire pyramids in it and stuff like this. And also like the oil thing has been a big conversation. So it's just interesting.
Yeah, it's learning from international examples is you know, it's a really good place to start. And so like obviously, so like Bonnie's talked about, so like land reform in Scotland, and there's also been sort of like land reform in Ireland as well. You know, not recently, but sort of like what tends to characterise that though is like foreign ownership of land, so like primarily sort of like English landowners owning a lot of land in Scotland, and English landowners owning a lot of land in Ireland, which, you know, establishes a sense of injustice, I guess. And if you look at Zimbabwe, for example, or in South Africa, so however long it is after the end of apartheid, and they still haven't resolved the land reform sort of like question there, and they're actually sort of like still debating the state's ability to expropriate land without compensation. So in the legislation in South Africa, they're trying to change it from having to sort of like pay landowners sort of like market value to something that they call a fair and equitable price. And that fair and equitable price could be nothing. Do you know what I mean? So it's, you know, it's you know, coming back to the issue about sort of like equity and sort of like fairness, rather than the market dictating what the value of land is and who has access to land.
Mm. Mm. So I think someone else, I was just going to comment on, someone said about people don't want to work on the land because it's not a popular job. But I think that's what we were surprised about, that the amount of people who want to do that. And that's what Chris Mage is arguing in his book, is that people are really interested in becoming farmers. And in fact, one of our speakers turned out to be one of my ex-students from a sixth form college in London, because she'd gone into the mining industry, did geology at university, and then found that not to her liking for obvious reasons, and got involved in food growing stuff in East London, and decided she wanted to become a farmer. Now she's got a farm in Sussex as part of the ecological food land co-op system. So I think there's loads of people like that. And so surprisingly, there might be more than you think that might be interested in going back to the land. So that was just in reply to one of the chat things.
Yeah. Sorry.
Anything else can you see? Oh, Leslie's.
Could I also add to that, Bonnie? I mean, I think one of the jobs that we have to do is to change the narrative around working on the land, because and the culture. I mean, a lot of people, when they think of, you know, farmers, it's backbreaking, it's endless, it's constant, you know, there's always something to be done, it's, you know, dawn to dusk. And a lot of farm work has changed, and with agroecological processes and all the science and new innovation that's coming through, it's really exciting and vibrant. And yes, quite a lot of physical work, but that's not bad, because sitting in front of the telly, we all know, is really bad for you, or in front of the computer, I should say. So it is exercise, it is a bit more physical work, but there is a lot of areas of innovation in all kinds. You know, it's not just about digging for 10 hours a day. So, and also it's not just about being on your own far away in the countryside, as a lot of urban growers are showing too. So there's a myriad of different ways you can get involved in food production now.
Okay, are there any more questions or observations? I'm just wondering whether it's like Brian has finished his dinner yet.
There was, I think David had his hand up before, or I saw his hand maybe.
Yeah, the previous person basically said what I was about to say. But yeah, there's something about yeah, changing what we mean by growing food. You know, like this can be a collective, communal kind of process, and it doesn't have to be in the sticks. Like we can think of like urban farms, peri-urban farms, things like that. Basically, what they just said. So yeah, I won't repeat their words.
Thanks. Again, just a little comment about, you know, I live in sort of like North London, and I'm really, you know, really keen on sort of like growing. I applied to my local authority to get a piece of land. Do you know what I mean? And I was told I had to wait 15 years to get an allotment. So even, you know, getting in at that level is sort of like really, really difficult. But I think that was part of what came through in our seminars. Is it's not an either or. You know, there are other ways of sort of like getting involved in community land growing, which Leslie, I think you were mentioning.
I wonder if there's something about like London has lots of parks, you know, and a lot of them are just lawn. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see if there's some kind of strategy of turning pieces of public parks into food growing places and that kind of thing. Because they're often local authority control, which is a bit easier, not easy by any stretch of the imagination, but easier than dealing with like private companies and that.
Well, I think that would be a bit of a problem, because during the pandemic, even though London does have a lot of parks, and people were desperate for green spaces. And I don't think it's fair that we have to give up green spaces to get food growing spaces, just because it's harder to attack big business and developers. We're scrabbling amongst ourselves, you know, the people who want green spaces, the people who want truly affordable housing, the people who want community spaces. Here we're having to fight for a very small amount of land. Really, we need to break into the land that's being used by, you know, that's being bought up by a lot of the developers to build really housing that's not being used for anyone apart from, I don't know, businessmen coming in and renting it for the week, or, you know, where they're working in the city, or, you know, I mean, all around me, I've got high rises everywhere, and they're certainly not for local people. So I don't know, I'm worried about that, because then what about the, you know, a lot of people are busy trying to defend green spaces, not give part of it up for food growing. And I think Gala said something about private parks. Yeah, but then private parks need to be opened up. But I think there's other scope. Tomorrow night, if you're interested, I'm putting on my, well, I'm not actually speaking, I'm just chairing. The Radical Housing Network is holding a meeting on food and housing. And we're looking at to what extent can we incorporate food growing on housing estates. So there's actually, again, not a fight between people who want housing and people who want food growing spaces, but how could we incorporate food growing into sort of bits of empty land on housing estates? So that could be a possibility. So we're going to hear from a few people on that tomorrow night. All right. So David, how's it looking on our answering questions? There's some very good comments in the chat, some resources. I hope people have taken notice. Oh, golf courses, definitely. that's something that needs to be dealt with. That will give us a bit more land. Yeah, excellent stuff. Yeah. Anyway, there's a lot of good points there. So I don't know, should we finish off then? Because people are, unless anyone has anything more to add. Okay, and we shall hopefully be seeing you when we'll let you all know about the next seminar series, and hopefully we'll all be learning together about how we can develop ideas of direct democracy and participatory democracy and citizens' assemblies. And obviously have a look at our website, and if you want to get involved in our work in any way, then do please contact us. And you know, you have been great participants actually, because you know, really some really good questions and comments and resources, and it's been really helpful actually.
And I've just popped the link to our website and to our YouTube channel. So if people are interested in the seminars that we ran on sort of like land and food and land and the environment, you can have a look at those there as well.
Yeah, I should say something. I just noticed a thank from, oh yeah, that really keep also, we are part of the Antiuniversity week of events. And we did actually do a session a couple of years ago with Antiuniversity as well, when we were face to face. But it's also worth, I don't know if people came through that website, but have a look at the remaining events for the next few days. As I said, the Radical Housing Network is doing a meeting tomorrow night. And but there might be other things. I think there's another one that looks quite interesting on mutual aid and things like that. I haven't looked at the full list of meetings, but it's well worth having a look at all of that. And I just have to confess to having not recorded my own presentation, because I was too busy thinking about the actual me doing my presentation. But I mean, if I can, I have recorded the discussion. I managed to remember to record the discussion, but I can easily do it again. Since I was just talking to myself anyway, there's no reason why I can't do my presentation again, because someone asked if we could send it out. So I might talk to myself again for 20 minutes and then and have that to send out. But I think the discussion's been quite good. So we'll do a bit of editing on it, and we can send that out to you as well. All right, thanks very much.
Yeah, so thanks, Bonnie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Hey, that wasn't too bad, was it?
That was all right, actually. Oops, I'm recording this as well. Let's stop this. Because that's the trouble when you're doing too much, is that sort of, but the point is it's